Speaker is Rebecca Hutchinson. Rebecca is a professor at Oregon State University. Her work consists of finding ways that computer science can contribute to promoting the health of Earth's ecosystems and bringing interesting new problems back to computer science. We're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, does that look all right? Great. Okay, right, so I'll talk a little bit about machine learning inspired by ecology, but I thought I'd start by introducing myself a little bit in case there was interest in just my career path, because I'm happy to take questions about this sort of thing as well. So I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I went to Bucknell University to get a Bachelor's of Science in Engineering and Computer Science. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon University to get a PhD in computer science. And during my PhD, I studied machine learning applied to brain imaging data. And then I moved on to Oregon State University for a postdoc, which is a postdoc is like a person that has a PhD, but is still doing an apprenticeship, basically, to transition to looking at machine learning applied to ecological problems and sustainability. And then I got a faculty position here, which is a little bit unique because my job is 70% in electrical engineering and computer science and 30% in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation sciences. And then I am going up for tenure soon. For folks that are not familiar with that process, the first part of being a professor and assistant professor is kind of like a probationary period, and then there's another evaluation that comes after that. So that's kind of how I've gotten here. And the job that I do now is comprised of research, teaching, and service. So I teach courses on machine learning for species distribution modeling, which I'll tell you about in a moment, artificial intelligence, and data science. And in terms of research, my team develops machine learning models and algorithms inspired by problems and data in ecology and conservation. So the inspiration for that is that we are in the midst of a sixth major mass extinction event on our planet. Species are disappearing quickly, but researchers are struggling to assess how bad the problem is. So this may seem like a biology problem, an ecology problem, a conservation problem, but there is a research community in computational sustainability of people who are looking to find ways that computer science can contribute to sustainability and solutions to some of these problems. And even more broadly, there's a community that thinks about AI for social good. So beyond just environmental sustainability into some social issues as well. So I want to make sure that at least everyone is aware of those communities. So for my work, it's kind of in that ecological space. And so how can we think about computer science having anything to do with conservation? Well, one place where these overlap is species distribution models. So these are some examples of SDMs. On the left, this is a fissure, and these are some maps of its potential distribution in Oregon. So the red line here is I-5, so this is Western Oregon. The hatched areas here are some places that it was introduced historically, and then we have its potential distribution with the darker green areas being more suitable habitat as predicted by the model. And then here's another example. These are the olive-sided flycatcher and the Pacific slope flycatcher. And these are distribution models over a 10-year span for each, where the brighter colors indicate a higher probability of occurrence for these species. So these models are very useful in conservation and in biology. They might be used to understand things, sort of fundamental science questions about the habitat requirements of a species, and they might be used to guide conservation actions. So if you were looking to introduce another fisher population or set aside a reserve to try to determine, to try to help conserve the species, where should you put that? Well, a model like this could inform that question, right? So how are these built? The task of an SDM is to estimate a function from environmental variables to the occurrence or abundance of the species based on field data. So this could be treated as a supervised machine learning problem. We have a data set here as an example, where in those examples of the fisher and the birds, my expert colleagues have gone out into the field at a bunch of different sites that have some different environmental variables. Elevation and precipitation are just some simple examples. Could be a variety of things there. And then some measure of the species. This is a simple example where the species is detected or not. Could be a count, and so on. The fisher, there were camera traps out there, and for the birds, people did point counts. So given a data set like this, we could ask a supervised machine learning method to come up with a classifier that for a new site, where you might be thinking about building a reserve, takes some environmental variables like elevation and precipitation as input, the classifier is the function, and then could output something like the probability that the species would survive there. Okay, so that's the gist of it. And so, you know, some kind of off-the-shelf machine learning methods can be useful in this space, but really the kind of research problems that my team works on are ways that it's actually not as simple as just a supervised machine learning problem. And so in the rest of our time, I will mention just a few of the questions that we're working on without going into a lot of detail on the solutions to give you an idea of the problem space. So one piece of inspiration is community science data. The examples I mentioned, the data was collected by experts. And that's a great way to do some studies. But there's also other opportunities. So if you don't know about eBird and you are interested in birds, you should definitely check it out. eBird is a program at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. You can get an app on your phone and record the birds that you see when you go for a walk and report that data back and contribute to science. So this is very exciting because community science can survey biodiversity at unprecedented scales. So before, those maps were looking at just bits of southwestern Oregon. With people recording data on this kind of an app, you get data coming in, millions of observations over, it's global actually. And so this is an example of what that data might look like. These are places where people have submitted checklists of birds on their phone. And the red ones are where the checklist included this indigo bunting, and the gray ones are where it did not. So this is a very exciting opportunity, but it comes with some challenges too. And we try to work in part on some of those challenges. So for example, this is my student Laurel and her dog. And one of the things that she's thinking about is the environmental inputs to those species distribution models. So we get species records from eBird from all over the state, but community scientists are just recording the birds. They're not recording the environmental variables. So we can't go back out and measure things at each of the sites that we have, you know, millions of data points, right? So she's asking, well, can we use satellite images instead to tell us about the environment at those points for input to the SDMs? And we think the answer is yes. So she's looking at, okay, if we have these data points from eBird, each of those can be associated with some satellite image. Those two can be the inputs to our model, and then we can try to predict which species we might see at the different locations. And the big research challenge from the machine learning point of view is how exactly should these satellite images go into the model? I mean, really, you know, images might have, let's say, red, green, and blue channels with some number in each of those channels. Should we just be feeding the raw data in like that, or should we be summarizing it in some way? This is called feature engineering. And some of you might have heard of deep learning, and you might have heard of it more in the context of the photos on the right side here, where deep learning systems are telling apart dogs from cats or different species of animals. There's been less work done on how to think about things like, from a satellite image, is the habitat fragmented? Is it a big continuous tract of habitat, or is it a bunch of little patches? Things like that. So that's what she's addressing in her research. Another problem that we encounter is called imperfect detection. And this just means that when let's say you go to a site like this to collect some species data, we typically do not observe everything that's there. Sometimes birds aren't singing. Lots of species are secretive and are not going to come out and display themselves when you're there. So there are established ways to deal with this, and experts anticipate this problem and set up their surveys to deal with it. I'll tell you how in a moment. But again, community scientists don't. They're birding just for fun, right? So we're thinking about how we can help deal with that in that context. So an example of imperfect detection. Did you notice the ocelot peeking out between the branches there? See the cat? Yeah. So that's a visual example. It's even more prevalent with birds that are often detected by ear rather than by sight. Okay, so how do we deal with imperfect detection? Experts set up their surveys during a time that a bird is there or not, that they'll go multiple times. And maybe in this example, on the third time, maybe they're looking for this Western tanager and they see it. They don't see it on the 2nd, they don't see it on the 15th, but maybe on the 17th they see it. There are models that are set up with the right assumptions that if we can say that the Western tanager was there or not the whole time, we only saw it on one of these visits, that's giving us some information. We only detect this bird about a third of the time when it's there. We can use that to help parse through the data and understand which times we might have seen 0 for not present, even though it was really present, and get a better estimate of its distribution. The problem is, again, the community scientists are not set up this way. This could be, let's say, 3 different observers who did not design their survey to try to get at this question. So we're thinking about, well, can we, after the fact, set up this structure so that we can deal with imperfect detection? So another student, Mark Roth, is working on this, and he's finding that existing solutions are not well suited to this problem. So he's looking at clustering algorithms, and clustering just means taking a set of points, like these black points, and trying to put them into groups it's usually an unsupervised task. So without labels about their cluster memberships. And so he's tried some clustering algorithms that exist, but say this orange one is putting these 2 into the same group, even though they're at very different elevations, just because they're geographically close to each other. And the pink existing one is putting these 2 into the same one as repeat observations, even though they're really far apart, just because they're the same habitat. So he's working on a better solution to grouping checklists into sites for dealing with imperfect detection. I'll give you one more example, and this one is really well set up by the previous presentation. Thank you so much, because this one's also about networks. So this is a beautiful montane meadow in the Cascade Mountains. And there was a summer program, REU. So for some of you that might be headed off to college soon, that's research experience for undergraduate, and it's a great thing to look for. So we had some REU students come for a 10-week program in the summer, and some of the team went out into meadows like this and looked at pollination networks. So they recorded every species of pollinator that visited every species of plant. So they would see this kind of bee go to this flower, and that kind of bee go to that flower, and so on. And if you aggregate all of those, they form a network. So here's a representation of that. Overall, they observed something like 600 pollinators and 100 plants. And so this is a different representation of a network than you just saw. But these are the links. So this would indicate that this pollinator and this flower interact rarely. This thicker one, these interact a little bit more, and then these interact a lot. This is a bipartite network, which is a thing that makes it different. There are only links between pollinators and plants, no links between plants, no links between pollinators. Ecologists have a variety of questions about this, like, if this species goes extinct, what will happen? Will this one also go extinct? Maybe. Or maybe there's some other kind of resilience built in. In contrast, if this one goes extinct, this pollinator has a lot of other choices to go to. But we think imperfect detection is at play here, and we don't understand as much as we'd like about the pollinator preferences. So one approach that we're taking here is to build a loose analogy to the way Netflix recommends movies to you. So Netflix has a bipartite network of users and movies, and very similarly to what the previous presenter talked about, you can look at what is likely to happen based on the things that are similar to you in the network. So this recommendation system is thinking about, based on what you've seen, what movies might you like to see that you haven't seen yet? We're using some similar underlying mathematical techniques to say, based on what we've seen this pollinator interact with, what other flowers might it be visiting, even though we didn't observe them in the field? It's a very loose analogy, but that is one of the angles that we're taking on this problem. So I'll stop there. Those are just a few of the problems that we're thinking about, really high level. Thanks to my wonderful students who contributed to this presentation and who are doing all the real work. And I'm happy to receive follow-up over email if there are further questions beyond our time here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I definitely didn't realize there were so many ways that computer science and ecology could overlap. So that was really interesting to learn about. We do have like one question in the chat, so we'll answer that quickly. Do you use deep learning to help contribute to rehabilitation?
Only indirectly at this point. So the deep learning connection is in the project with the satellite imagery. So trying to figure out how these images should be summarized and turned into features that can then be linked to the species. And so that feeds into, we're trying to build a better process for species distribution models, but we don't have a collaborator who is doing conservation with this project yet. Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, so I think we'll move on to a break. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to both of our professors. So now